A millionaire walks peacefully through the streets after a business lunch when a little beggar girl approaches and asks for a hug. The man, who already knew the child, doesn't refuse. But without him realizing it, she takes his phone from his pocket during a moment of distraction. When he discovers the theft, he becomes furious and feels betrayed. After all, he always donated money to her. The next day, while watching the news on TV, he gets the biggest shock of his life when he sees the little beggar girl unconscious. But the sinister reason behind it makes him break down in tears. The late afternoon sun cast a soft glow on Edward Miller's face as he walked through the bustling downtown streets. The scent of sizzling street food and freshly brewed coffee mingled with the familiar hum of traffic and the hurried chatter of passers-by. At 55, Edward had built a financial empire, yet he preferred strolling the city's simple sidewalks to being chauffeured in luxury cars. There was something comforting in that urban routine, connecting him to the reality of everyday people. His steps paused when he spotted a familiar small figure sitting on the sidewalk. It was Maria, a girl of about 7, with disheveled brown hair and clothes that had definitely seen better days. For the past 6 months, Edward had always found her in the same spot, invariably stopping to chat and leave a few dollars or a snack. There was something special about that child that profoundly touched his solitary heart. Maria looked up as he approached, her face lighting up with a shy smile that always melted Edward's emotional defenses. He had lost his wife 3 years prior and had never had children. That street-smart girl had, in some mysterious way, filled a void he hadn't even known existed in his generous soul. "Hey there, little one," Edward said, crouching down to her level. "How was your day today?" Maria fidgeted nervously with her hands, a gesture Edward knew well. Whenever she wanted something out of the ordinary, she showed that same adorable hesitation. He waited patiently, knowing she would find the courage to speak. "Uncle Edward," she whispered, using the affectionate nickname she'd given him. "Today, I don't want money or food." Her voice was barely audible amidst the street noise. "Can you give me a hug?" The simple request washed over Edward like a wave of pure emotion. In all these months of their meetings, Maria had always accepted his generosity with gratitude, but she had never asked for something so intimate, so human. Tears welled in his eyes as he opened his arms. "Of course, my dear, come here." Maria quickly got up and threw herself into his arms, hugging him with the desperate strength of a child who had forgotten what it felt like to be protected. Edward wrapped his arms around her gently, feeling how small and fragile she was against his chest. For a moment, the world around them disappeared. There was no more traffic noise, no smell of street food, no hurried pedestrians. There was only a solitary man and an abandoned girl, connected by a pure, inexplicable love. "Thank you, Uncle," she murmured against his shoulder. "I really needed that today." Edward held her for a few more seconds, imprinting that moment onto his memory. There was something different about the way she hugged him, an urgency he couldn't quite grasp. When they finally separated, Maria took a few steps back and waved shyly. "See you tomorrow, Uncle Edward. See you tomorrow, little one." Edward watched her walk away, feeling a strange mix of happiness and melancholy. That hug had been more meaningful than any multi-million-dollar deal he'd ever closed. He straightened his suit jacket and checked his watch. He still had time to get to the office and handle some pending matters. As he walked toward the office building where his company was located, Edward couldn't stop thinking about Maria's hug. There was something special about that gesture, a purity he didn't find in the corporate world. He decided that the next day he would bring her a special gift, perhaps a children's storybook or a toy that might bring a little joy to her difficult life. Lost in thought about how he could help Maria more meaningfully, Edward reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket to grab his cell phone and check important messages. His fingers met only empty fabric. His cell phone was gone. Edward stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, his heart quickening as he frantically searched all the pockets of his suit jacket and pants. The phone was definitely not there. His hands trembled slightly as he mentally replayed his entire route from the restaurant until that moment. He had checked the device during lunch. He was sure of it. Since then, he had walked directly along the same route as always, without deviations or stops, except for the encounter with Maria. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The only person who had been close enough to take his phone was the girl he had just hugged. During those seconds of tenderness, when he was completely vulnerable and emotional, she had taken advantage of his kindness to steal it. No, it can't be, he murmured to himself, shaking his head in denial. She's just a child. But the evidence was undeniable. Maria was the only person who had had enough physical access to remove the device from his inner pocket. The hug Edward had considered the purest moment of his day now revealed itself to be a cruel act, calculated to distract him while she committed the theft. Edward rushed back to the spot where he had left Maria, but she had already disappeared. The patch of sidewalk where she usually sat was empty, as if she had never existed. He asked some street vendors in the area if they had seen where she went, but they all shrugged or shook their heads negatively. "The little girl who's always here. She ran off right after you left," said an old man running a coffee stand nearby. "She seemed in a hurry, very agitated. That's not like her." The confirmation made Edward feel a devastating mix of anger, sadness, and disappointment. For 6 months, he had believed he was building a genuine relationship with that child. He had felt proud to be making a difference in someone's needy life. Now he discovered he had just been an easy target, a lonely and naive man manipulated by a small-time criminal. He walked to the office with heavy steps, trying to process the betrayal. His phone contained important business information, influential client contacts, and even some automatically saved passwords. Beyond the sentimental value, there was a serious, practical issue to resolve. At the office, Edward immediately asked his secretary, Carla, to cancel his phone's SIM card and get him a new device. She noticed his distraught state and asked if everything was all right. "I was robbed," he said dryly, avoiding details about the circumstances. Please change all passwords for the business accounts that had automatic synchronization with the device." Carla, an experienced woman in her 60s who had worked with Edward for over a decade, sensed there was more to the story than he was letting on. She knew her boss too well not to notice when something profoundly affected him. "Mr. Miller, you seem very distressed. Are you sure everything's all right?" Edward sighed deeply, feeling the weight of disillusionment on his shoulders. "Carla, do you believe a 7-year-old child can be capable of conscious manipulation?" The question caught his secretary by surprise. "Well, children are smarter than we give them credit for, especially those who live in difficult circumstances. Why do you ask?" "Nothing specific, just questioning human nature." For the rest of the afternoon, Edward tried to focus on work, but his mind kept drifting back to Maria, the image of her shy smile, the way her eyes lit up when he agreed to the hug, the affectionate way she called him Uncle Edward. It all seemed fake now, a rehearsed performance to deceive a kind and lonely man. What hurt him most wasn't the loss of his phone, but the destruction of something he had considered pure and genuine. Maria represented his faith in human goodness, his belief that small gestures of kindness could make a difference in the world. Now, that faith was shaken. At the end of the day, as he prepared to leave, Edward made a decision. He would return to the spot where he always met Maria the next day. He needed to confront her. He needed to understand how such a small child had managed to manipulate his feelings so effectively. But a part of him, a small, stubborn part, still hoped there was a different explanation. An explanation that could save his faith in humanity. Edward barely slept that night. Lying in his king-size bed in the quiet, luxurious apartment, he tossed and turned constantly, his mind filled with images of Maria. With each passing hour, his initial anger gave way to a growing concern. Where would she be now? What would she do with the phone? Did she truly understand what she had done? At dawn, he was already dressed and ready to go. He arrived downtown, even before the first merchants opened their doors, heading directly to the spot where he always met Maria. The area was empty, only a few homeless individuals still sleeping on cardboard scattered across the sidewalk. Edward waited for 2 hours, observing every movement on the street, hoping to see the small, familiar figure appear from some corner. When pedestrian traffic increased with the start of business hours, he began approaching people who might have seen her. "Excuse me, do you know a girl about 7 years old who usually stays around here asking for change?" he asked each person who passed. Most shook their heads negatively or hurried along, uncomfortable with the conversation. An old man selling newspapers on the corner remembered her. "Oh, little Maria. She's been around here for years, but yesterday she ran by, very agitated. She seemed scared, you know." "Haven't seen her since." "Scared," Edward repeated, feeling a tightening in his chest. "Any idea what might have happened?" "Look, mister, these street kids live through things we can't even imagine. It could be a million things, but she looked like she was running from something or someone." Edward spent the entire day pounding the downtown pavement, visiting every spot where unhoused children typically sought refuge. He spoke with other homeless individuals, with volunteers from social organizations, with police officers patrolling the area. Everyone knew Maria, but no one had seen her since the previous day. "She's a smart and brave girl," said a woman who worked at a community soup kitchen. "She's always been very cautious, never got into trouble. If she just disappeared like that, something serious must have happened." The woman's words echoed in Edward's mind all the way back home. Brave, cautious. These weren't characteristics he would associate with a small, opportunistic thief. He began to question his own conclusions about what had happened. That night, Edward made a decision his friends and advisors would consider reckless. He called Robert Stone, a private investigator he had worked with on some business matters in the past. "Robert, I need you to find someone for me. It's urgent." "Of course, Edward. Who are we talking about?" "A street girl. 7 years old, named Maria. She's usually in the downtown area." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Edward, are you sure? Looking for missing children is complicated. There are protocols. She's not officially missing. It's a personal situation. I can pay whatever it takes." Robert had known Edward for years and knew he wouldn't make such a request without an important reason. "All right, I'll mobilize my team." "What else can you tell me about her?" Edward provided every detail he could remember about Maria, her appearance, the spots she usually frequented, the people who might know her. As he spoke, he realized how little he truly knew about her life, despite months of regular encounters. "Edward, may I ask why this is so important to you?" The question caught Edward off guard. How could he explain that a street girl had become proof that goodness still existed in the world? How could he say that his faith in humanity depended on finding her and understanding the truth of what had happened? "She might be in danger," he finally said, "and I feel responsible." After hanging up the phone, Edward poured himself a whiskey and sat in his favorite armchair, gazing out the panoramic window at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Maria was lost, possibly scared, perhaps at risk. The anger he had felt the day before seemed insignificant now, replaced by a desperate urgency to find her. It no longer mattered if she had stolen his phone. All that mattered was knowing she was safe. Edward had the unsettling feeling that something was deeply wrong with the situation, something he still couldn't fully comprehend. 3 days passed with no news of Maria. Edward had drastically cut back his office activities, delegating important meetings to fully dedicate himself to the search. Carla watched with growing concern the state of her boss, who seemed consumed by an obsession she couldn't entirely comprehend. "Mr. Miller, you need to rest," she said for the 3rd time that morning. "You're killing yourself pacing the streets." Edward barely heard her. He was studying a city map spread across his desk, marking with colored pins all the locations where he had searched for Maria. Robert had mobilized his team, but so far the investigations had not yielded concrete results. The phone rang, and Edward answered immediately, hoping it was the investigator with good news. "Edward, it's Robert. I need to speak with you in person. I have some information I'd rather not discuss over the phone." The grave tone in the investigator's voice sent a chill down Edward's spine. "Did you find anything about Maria?" "I found some leads, disturbing ones. Can you come to my office now?" An hour later, Edward sat in Robert's modest office, watching the investigator organize some papers on his desk. Robert was a simple-looking man, but Edward knew that behind that unassuming facade was one of the best investigative professionals in the city. "Edward, before we start, I need you to tell me exactly what happened between you and this girl. Don't leave out any details." Edward took a deep breath and recounted the entire story: his regular meetings with Maria, his discreet generosity, her requested hug, the disappearance of his phone. Robert jotted everything down in a notebook, asking specific questions about times and locations. "You said your phone disappeared during the hug?" Robert asked, looking up from his notebook. "It's the only logical explanation. She was the only one close enough." Robert was silent for a few seconds, tapping his fingers on the table. "Edward, I've discovered some things about Maria that might change your perspective on what happened." He opened a folder and pulled out some photographs. "These were taken by my team in the past few days. Do you recognize any of these men?" Edward examined the photos. They showed 2 suspicious-looking men talking on a street corner near where he usually met Maria. He didn't recognize them, but there was something menacing about their expressions and posture. "These individuals have been seen circling the area where you met Maria for at least 2 weeks, Robert explained. "My contacts in law enforcement identified them as members of a crew specializing in kidnapping affluent businessmen." Edward's blood ran cold. "Kidnappings. They use advanced tech to track their targets, cell phone signal interception, routine monitoring, identifying vulnerabilities." Robert paused, letting the information sink in. "Edward, you were marked as a target. That doesn't make sense. How would they know who I am? You're a wealthy man with predictable habits. You walk alone down the same streets every day at the same time. To them, you were a perfect target." Edward stood up from his chair, walking to the window. The revelation completely altered his understanding of recent events. "And Maria? What does she have to do with this?" "That's the most interesting part," Robert said, pulling another photo from the folder. "This one was taken 3 days before your phone disappeared." The image showed Maria hidden behind a dumpster, clearly observing the 2 suspicious men talking a few yards away. Her expression was one of fear and concentration, as if she were trying to listen to their conversation. "My God," Edward murmured. "She knew. Looks like it." "And there's more." Robert showed another photo, taken the next day. Here she is following them, keeping her distance, but clearly interested in their activities. Edward felt his knees buckle. He returned to the chair, trying to process the implications of what he was seeing. "Are you saying Maria was protecting me?" "It's a possibility we can't rule out. A street kid develops highly acute survival instincts. She might have noticed you were being watched. But why didn't she tell me directly?" Robert shrugged. "Maybe she didn't know how to explain, or she feared you wouldn't believe her. Children sometimes act on impulse, especially when they want to protect someone they care about." Edward buried his face in his hands, feeling a devastating mix of remorse and fear. If Robert was right, Maria hadn't stolen his phone out of greed or malice. She had tried to save him from a real threat, putting her own safety at risk. "Robert, where is she now?" The investigator hesitated before answering. "Edward, this is the part that worries me most. No one has seen her since she disappeared. It's like she's vanished off the face of the earth." The silence that followed was heavy with terrible implications. Edward knew he was facing the possibility that his own vulnerability had put an innocent child in mortal danger. Edward spent the night awake, pacing his apartment like a caged animal. Robert's revelations echoed in his mind, each new piece of information completely reorganizing his understanding of events. The image of Maria hidden behind the dumpster, watching the criminals with a scared expression, wouldn't leave his head. At dawn, he was back on the streets, but now with a completely different perspective. He was no longer looking for a small thief who had betrayed his trust. He was looking for a brave child who had possibly sacrificed her own safety to protect him. The guilt weighed on his shoulders like a physical burden. For 6 months, he had been proud of his discreet generosity toward Maria, feeling good about making a difference in her life. Now he realized that, inadvertently, he had become a source of danger for the girl. "How could I have been so naive?" he murmured to himself as he walked the familiar streets. His predictable routine, his regular habits, his trusting nature, all of it had made him an easy target for professional criminals. Edward stopped in front of the spot where he always met Maria, observing the empty sidewalk. He tried to imagine how she must have felt, discovering that dangerous men were planning something against him. A 7-year-old child living on the streets, facing the terrible dilemma of how to protect someone she cared about without knowing exactly how to act. "She's just a child," he said aloud, feeling tears sting his eyes. "And I judged her as if she were an adult criminal." A passing man looked at him strangely, but Edward didn't care. He was lost in his own reflections, trying to mentally reconstruct the past few days from a new perspective. The hug Maria had asked for now took on a completely different dimension. It hadn't been a calculated distraction to facilitate a theft. It had been the desperate gesture of a child who knew she was about to do something risky and perhaps wanted to say goodbye to the only person who had shown kindness in her difficult life. Edward took his new phone from his pocket and called Robert. "I need you to expand the investigation," he said without preamble. "I want you to find out everything about these criminals, who they are, how they operate, where they might be holding Maria. Edward, I need to be honest with you. If they really captured the girl, the chances of finding her diminish with each passing hour." The brutal statement hit Edward like a punch. "I won't accept that possibility. She risked everything to protect me. Now it's my turn to protect her. I understand your determination, but this is dangerous. If they find out you're actively searching..." "I don't care about the risks to me," Edward interrupted. "Maria faced dangers to save me. I can't do any less for her." After hanging up, Edward made a decision his friends would consider reckless. He headed to the nearest police precinct and asked to speak with the captain in charge of juvenile crimes. Captain Henry Thompson was an experienced man, with over 20 years on the force. He listened attentively as Edward recounted the entire situation, from his regular meetings with Maria to the recent discoveries about the kidnappers. "Mr. Miller, I understand your concern, but I need to clarify that this doesn't officially constitute a kidnapping case yet," the captain said. "The girl has no known legal guardians, and we don't have concrete evidence that she was taken against her will. But the photographs your investigator obtained, they're circumstantial. They show her observing suspicious individuals, but they don't prove a direct connection to her disappearance." Edward felt his frustration grow. "Captain Thompson, a 7-year-old child, disappeared after trying to protect me from criminals. Can't there be an official procedure for this?" The captain sighed, recognizing the genuine anguish on Edward's face. "I can open a preliminary investigation based on the information you've provided, but it will be a slow process, and I can't guarantee immediate resources. Do whatever it takes. I'm willing to cover any additional expenses." Upon leaving the police precinct, Edward felt a little more hopeful. At least now there were official channels working to find Maria, in addition to Robert's private investigation. But as he walked the familiar streets, he couldn't shake the terrible feeling that time was running out. Somewhere in the city, a brave little girl was paying the price for his kindness. Edward looked up at the grey afternoon sky and made a silent promise. He would find Maria no matter what it took. She had risked everything to protect him. Now it was his turn to honor that extraordinary courage. A week had passed since Maria's disappearance when Robert called with the first concrete lead. Edward was in his office, unsuccessfully trying to focus on important contracts, when his phone rang. "Edward, we've got something," Robert said without preamble. "My team found a witness who saw Maria the night she disappeared." Edward dropped the pen he was holding. "Where? Was she okay?" "It's complicated. The witness is a homeless man named John, who's known Maria for years. He saw her running down Blossom Street near the bus terminal around 9 in the evening. Running? Running from someone? According to John, she seemed desperate, constantly looking back. She was carrying something in her hands. He believes it was a cell phone." The information definitively confirmed that Maria had taken the phone to protect him, not to steal it. Edward closed his eyes, feeling a mix of relief that his faith in the girl was restored and terror at the danger she had faced. "Robert, I need to go see John. He might have more information." "I've already thought of that. I've set up a meeting for this afternoon, but Edward, be prepared. The conditions where John lives are difficult." 3 hours later, Edward was in a derelict part of the city he rarely visited. Dilapidated buildings, grimy streets, and a persistent smell of urine and garbage made up the desolate landscape. Robert led him through a labyrinth of alleys to a partially demolished building. John was a man of indeterminate age, with disheveled grey hair and clothes that hadn't seemed to be washed in weeks. But his eyes were surprisingly clear and intelligent when Edward introduced himself. "You're the rich man Maria always talked about," John said without ceremony. "She really liked you. Always said you were different from the others. She talked about me. Sure, said you treated her like a person, not a nuisance, that you looked her in the eye when you talked." John spat on the ground. "Not many people do that with folks like us." Edward crouched down to John's level, unconsciously repeating the gesture he always made with Maria. "John, I need to find her. Can you tell me everything you remember from that night?" John stared fixedly at Edward, as if assessing his sincerity. After a few seconds, he nodded. "Maria came running, really scared. Never seen her like that. She's always been brave, you know, but that night she was terrified." "Did she explain what was happening?" "Said bad men were after you, that they'd found out where you lived through your phone. She took the device so they couldn't track you anymore." Edward felt a lump in his throat. A 7-year-old child thought of a solution that an experienced adult couldn't imagine. Maria's special, John agreed, but she also said something else important. She said she overheard those men planning to grab you the next day, on your usual lunch route. Next day? But that was a week ago. Exactly. If she hadn't done what she did, you probably wouldn't be here talking to me now. The revelation hit Edward with full force. Maria had not only tried to protect him, she had saved his life. While he judged her as a petty thief, she was risking everything to prevent his kidnapping. John, did she say where she was going afterwards? She said she needed to hide until she was sure you were safe. She knew a place where the bad men would never look. What place? John shook his head. Didn't say, but Maria knows this city better than anyone. If anyone can hide, it's her. Edward pulled a considerable amount of cash from his pocket and offered it to John. And if you learn anything, any information about Maria, call me at this number. John accepted the money, but his gaze remained serious. Mr. Miller, can I give you some advice? Maria did this because she likes you. She has no family, no one. You were the only person who made her feel important. What are you trying to say? If she's hiding, it's because she still believes you're in danger. The only way to get her out of hiding is to prove you're safe. John's words echoed in Edward's mind all the way back. Maria was sacrificing her own safety because she believed he was still at risk. He needed to find a way to communicate to her that he was safe, that she could come out of hiding without fear. But how to find a child who knew the city better than he did and was determined to remain invisible? Edward woke up early the next morning, determined to implement a plan to lure Maria back. If she was hiding because she believed he was still in danger, he needed to find a way to communicate that he was safe. He planned to return to the spot where he always met her and leave signs that the situation had changed. He was having coffee when his cell phone rang. Robert called, urgency in his voice. Edward, turn on the TV now. Channel 7, morning news. His heart pounding. Edward grabbed the remote and tuned to the indicated channel. The anchorwoman was narrating a news story that made his world come crashing down. A girl, approximately 7 years old, was found unconscious last night on a derelict street in the city's outskirts. According to preliminary police investigations, she was an apparent victim of kidnapping and interrogation. The child is hospitalized at City Hospital in stable condition, but has not yet been identified. Edward dropped his coffee cup to the floor, the hot liquid spilling across the rug as he stared at the screen in shock. The cameras showed an ambulance, and for a few seconds, before the stretcher was loaded into the vehicle, he managed to catch a glimpse of a small, pale face he immediately recognized. It was Maria. "No, no, no," he murmured, frantically searching for his car keys. He called Robert as he ran to the garage. "And did you see?" "I did. I'm on my way to the hospital now. I'll meet you there." During the longest 20 minutes of his life, Edward drove through the morning traffic, trying not to imagine what Maria had endured. The news had mentioned interrogation. A 7-year-old child, interrogated by criminals. Guilt consumed him like acid. At the hospital, Edward had to use all his influence and some important contacts to get information about Maria. The girl was in the pediatric ICU, sedated but in stable condition. Doctors were not yet allowing visitors. Dr. Frank Owens, the attending physician, explained the situation with professional gravity. The child arrived in a state of severe shock and dehydration. There are signs she was held captive for several hours, possibly days. Physically, she has no serious injuries, but the psychological trauma is considerable. "Did she say anything?" Edward asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. During her feverish delirium, she constantly repeated a few phrases. "I can't tell them where Uncle lives," and "they'll hurt him if I talk." Edward felt his legs give out. He had to lean against the wall to keep from falling. Maria had been tormented for information about him and had refused to speak, even under threat. Robert arrived minutes later, bringing devastating information from the police. Edward, the situation is worse than we imagined. The kidnappers didn't just stumble upon Maria. What do you mean? They tracked your cell phone signal to where she was hiding. They used location technology to find her. The revelation was like a punch to Edward's gut. My phone, the very one she took to protect me, was used to hunt her down. Exactly, and there's more. During the interrogation, according to evidence the police found at the site where she was held, they tried to force her to reveal your identity, where you live, your habits. They wanted her to lead them to you. Edward buried his face in his hands, and she didn't talk. According to medical reports, she resisted for hours. A 7-year-old child faced adult criminals and refused to betray you. In that moment, Edward fully grasped the extent of Maria's courage. She had not only tried to save him by taking his phone, she had endured interrogation and threats to protect his location. An abandoned girl, with no family, had shown more loyalty and bravery than many adults in his life. Robert, I want these criminals found and arrested. Use all necessary resources. The police are already working on it. The site where they held Maria provided several leads. But Edward, you need to understand that your safety is still at risk. They didn't get the information they wanted. Edward looked through the hospital window toward the pediatric ICU, where Maria was fighting to recover. I don't care about my safety. I only care that she recovers and knows she's protected now. Did the doctor say when you can see her? Not yet, but I'm staying here until I can speak with her. Edward turned to Robert, his eyes shining with determination. Robert, I want you to do something for me. I want to officially adopt her. Robert raised his eyebrows. Edward, that's a very serious decision. She risked her life to protect me. She's the bravest person I've ever met. If she doesn't have a family, then I'll be her family. While awaiting news about Maria's condition, Edward made the most important decision of his life. That extraordinary child had completely changed his understanding of courage, loyalty, and love. Now it was his turn to live up to the courage she had shown. Edward spent the night at the hospital, sleeping uncomfortably in a waiting room chair. He couldn't bring himself to leave, even knowing it would still be hours until he could see Maria. Compassionate nurses occasionally brought him coffee and reassured him about her condition, but he remained on constant vigil. The next morning, Dr. Frank Owens sought him out with encouraging news. Mr. Miller, Maria is awake and conscious. Her vitals are stable, and she's responding well to treatment. Would you like to see her? Edward immediately stood up, smoothing his rumpled clothes. Is she speaking? Still very little. She's scared and confused. She constantly asks if Uncle is okay. The doctor paused. I assume that's you. Yes. Can I go in now? You can, but I need to caution you. She's been through a traumatic experience. There might be unpredictable reactions. Try to keep the conversation calm and positive. Edward followed the doctor through the hospital's white corridors, his heart pounding with anticipation and nervousness. When they reached the pediatric ICU room, he saw Maria for the first time in over a week. She looked even smaller lying in the hospital bed, connected to some monitoring equipment. Her face was pale, but her eyes still held the same intelligent sparkle Edward knew so well. When she saw him, her eyes filled with tears. "Uncle Edward," she exclaimed weakly, trying to sit up in bed. Edward approached slowly, not wanting to startle her with sudden movements. "Hi, my dear, how are you feeling? Are you okay? They didn't hurt you?" Maria's questions tumbled out, laden with genuine concern. Edward felt a lump in his throat. Even after everything she had been through, her first concern was for his well-being. "I'm fine, Maria. I'm perfectly fine. And you? How are you feeling?" "Scared," she admitted softly. "The bad men got me. They asked where you lived. They wanted me to tell them your secrets." Edward sat carefully on the edge of the bed, resisting the urge to hug her immediately. "And what did you tell them?" "Nothing." "I didn't say anything." Maria lifted her chin with surprising determination for someone so small. "You're good to me. I wasn't going to let the bad men hurt you." The tears Edward had held back for days finally fell. "Maria, you are the bravest person I know, but you didn't have to put yourself in danger for my sake. You always took care of me," she said simply. "It was my turn to take care of you." Edward finally couldn't resist and gently held her small hand. Maria, I need to apologize. When my phone disappeared, I thought you had stolen it from me." Maria lowered her eyes, looking ashamed. "I'm sorry I took it without asking, but I heard the bad men talking about how they could track you by your phone. I thought if I took it, they couldn't find you anymore." "You were right. You saved my life, Maria. But they found me anyway," she said sadly. The phone kept making little noises. "And they followed the sound." Edward closed his eyes, feeling the weight of responsibility once more. The technology that should have connected him to the world had become a weapon against an innocent child. "Maria, the bad men have been arrested. They can't hurt anyone anymore. You're safe now. And you, are you safe?" "Yes, I'm safe. Thanks to you." Maria smiled for the first time since she'd woken up, a small but genuine smile that lit up her pale face. "Oh, that's good. I was so worried." Edward took a deep breath, preparing to ask the most important question of his life. "Maria, when you leave the hospital, where would you like to go?" She shrugged. "Back to the streets. That's where I live." "What if I told you that you don't have to live on the streets anymore, that there's a place where you'll always be welcome, where you'll be cared for and loved?" Maria looked at him with curiosity. What place is that?" "My home. I want you to come live with me, Maria. I want to be your family." Maria's eyes widened in surprise. "Really? You want me to be your daughter? More than anything in the world? If you want to, of course." Maria was silent for a few seconds, processing the offer. Then her face lit up with the most radiant smile Edward had ever seen. "Yes, I do, Daddy Edward." The word Daddy hit Edward like a bolt of pure happiness. He finally hugged her, feeling how small and precious she was in his arms. In that moment, in a hospital room, surrounded by the antiseptic smell and the hum of medical equipment, Edward found the family he hadn't even known he was looking for. The next few days at the hospital passed in a quiet routine of recovery and planning. Edward had hired the best child psychologists to help Maria process the trauma she had experienced. And she responded to the treatment with the same courage she had shown throughout the ordeal. Dr. Frank Owens was impressed by the speed of her recovery. "She's an extraordinarily resilient child," he commented to Edward during one of their daily conversations. "Having someone who loves her unconditionally is making all the difference." Edward had completely transformed his routine to be present throughout the recovery process. He had delegated most of his business responsibilities to fully dedicate himself to Maria. For the first time in years, something was more important than his business. "Daddy Edward," Maria said on a sunny afternoon as they flipped through a children's storybook he had brought. "What will our home be like?" Edward smiled, loving how naturally she already referred to him as Dad. "Well, first we'll remodel a special room just for you." "What colors do you like?" "Pink and yellow," she answered without hesitation. "And can I have stuffed animals?" "As many as you want. and books, toys, pretty clothes. Edward paused, realizing he was describing material things. But the most important thing is that it will be a place where you'll always feel safe and loved. Maria nodded seriously. And you'll always be there. Always. I promise. Robert visited daily, bringing updates on the case. The police had identified and arrested all members of the crew involved in Maria's kidnapping. The private investigator also brought news about the legal adoption procedures. Edward, I spoke with a social worker specializing in adoptions. Since Maria has no known relatives and is under temporary state care, the process might be relatively quick, considering the special circumstances. How quick? A few weeks, maybe a month. Your stable financial situation and the fact that Maria has clearly expressed a desire to stay with you greatly facilitate the process. Edward felt a mix of anxiety and hope. He wanted everything to be formalized as quickly as possible, but he also understood the need for all legal procedures to be followed correctly. During one of their afternoon conversations, Maria asked a question that caught Edward by surprise. Daddy Edward, why were you always so nice to me when I was on the street? Edward thought carefully before answering. Because you reminded me that there's goodness in the world, and because I was lonely too, in a different way. You were lonely even though you had a big house. Sometimes loneliness isn't about where we live, Maria. It's about having someone who truly cares about us. Maria held his hand. Now neither of us is alone. Exactly. Now we're a family. The sessions with her private tutor revealed that Maria was extremely intelligent, despite never having attended school. She learned with impressive speed, absorbing knowledge with the hunger of someone who had been deprived of educational opportunities. She has exceptional academic potential, commented Ms. Helen Peterson during a conversation with Edward. With the right support, she can achieve any goal she sets. Edward felt growing pride not only in Maria's intelligence, but in her unique personality. She retained the courage and empathy she had shown on the streets. But now, she had the security to also express her natural creativity and curiosity. One Sunday afternoon, as Maria was drawing in the living room, she looked up and said, Daddy Edward, want to know something? I always dreamed of having a family. But I never imagined it would be this good. Edward stopped reading his newspaper and looked at her attentively. What do you mean? On the streets. I imagined having a family would just mean having a warm place to sleep and food every day. But it's much more than that, right? It's having someone who cares when you're sad, who's happy when you learn something new, who hugs you when you're scared. Exactly. Edward agreed, feeling tears welling in his eyes. And you know what? I always dreamed of having a family too, and I also discovered it's much better than I imagined. Maria smiled and went back to drawing. Edward watched her work, recognizing that she wasn't just a child he had saved. She was an extraordinary person who had also saved him from a life empty of true purpose. That night, as he tucked Maria into bed, she made an observation that would forever be etched in Edward's memory. Daddy, do you know what the best day of my life was? What was that? The day I asked you for a hug on the street. That's when everything started to get good. Edward gently kissed her forehead. For me too, my dear. For me too. 3 weeks after Maria arrived at Edward's home, when their family routine finally seemed established and peaceful, Robert appeared one Friday morning with a worried expression Edward knew all too well. Now we need to talk, Robert said as soon as Edward opened the door. It's about Maria. Edward felt a cold knot in his stomach. She's in the garden playing. What happened? Robert looked toward the garden where Maria was building little houses with colorful blocks, her joyful laughter echoing through the sunny morning. Edward, we've received information that the crew had more members than we thought. Some of them weren't caught. What does that mean? It means they know Maria can identify them and they know where she is now. Edward closed the door and led Robert to his office, where they could talk without Maria hearing them. Robert, tell me exactly what you found out. My contacts in law enforcement intercepted phone conversations between remaining members of the crew. They're planning a second attempt, not to kidnap her this time, but to permanently silence her. The word silence echoed in Edward's mind with terrifying implications. When? How did you find this out? The interceptions happened last night. From what we understand, they intend to act over the weekend, when they believe security will be more relaxed. Edward looked out the office window, watching Maria play carefree in the garden. The thought that anyone would want to harm that innocent child filled him with a rage he had never felt before. What does the police plan to do? They're working to locate the remaining criminals, but so far they haven't had any success. That's why I'm here. We need to take immediate protective measures. Edward stood up and began pacing his office, his mind working quickly. What kind of measures? A safe house, 24-hour police protection, or... Robert hesitated. Or what? Or we use Maria as bait to lure them out and apprehend them once and for all. Edward stopped pacing and stared at Robert in disbelief. Are you suggesting I use a 7-year-old child as bait for dangerous criminals? Edward, listen, it would be entirely controlled. We'd have undercover officers on every corner, sharpshooters positioned, the entire operation monitored. Maria would never be in any real danger. No? Edward's answer was categorical. I won't put Maria in danger, not even controlled. She's suffered enough already. Robert sighed. I understand your position, but think, as long as these criminals are free, you'll live in constant fear. Maria will never truly be free. Edward looked out the window again. Maria had abandoned her blocks and was now chasing a butterfly, her small arms outstretched in a futile but adorable attempt to catch it. The image of purity and innocence contrasted brutally with the conversation he was having. Is there any alternative? A safe house until the criminals are caught. But it could take weeks, even months. And that would mean Maria would be isolated, unable to go out, unable to live normally. Exactly. Edward closed his eyes, feeling the weight of an impossible decision. Protecting Maria meant depriving her of the freedom she had just gained. But not protecting her adequately meant risking losing her forever. At that moment, Maria ran into the office, breathless and her cheeks flushed from playing so hard. Daddy Edward, did you see? I almost caught a giant blue butterfly. She paused, noticing Robert and the serious expression on both men's faces. Uncle Robert, why do you both look sad? Edward crouched down to her level, forcing a smile. We're not sad, sweetie. Just talking about work. How about we go out for lunch today? Really? Can we go to that diner that has the happy face burgers? We can. Maria ran off to get ready, shouting with joy. Edward turned to Robert with a determination that surprised the investigator. Robert, hire the best security team you can find. I want discreet but absolute protection, and I want these criminals found and arrested before they have a chance to get anywhere near Maria. Edward. That's going to cost a fortune. Edward looked once more toward the staircase Maria had ascended, still hearing her joyful laughter coming from upstairs. Robert, I'd spend everything I have to protect that child. Money can be replaced. She's irreplaceable. Robert nodded, understanding the absolute determination on Edward's face. I'll mobilize the best professionals available. But Edward, you need to be prepared. The next few days could be intense. Edward took a deep breath, mentally preparing for the battle ahead. Maria had shown extraordinary courage to protect him. Now it was his turn to show he would live up to her courage. On Saturday night, Edward was in his bedroom reading while Maria slept peacefully in the next room, when a subtle noise from the garden made him look up from his book. The security team Robert had hired was discreetly positioned around the property, but something about the quality of that sound put him on alert. He grabbed his cell phone and sent a quick message to the head of the security team: "Noise in the garden, West Sector." The reply came immediately: "Checking, stay put." Edward silently got up and approached the window, trying to see through the curtains without exposing himself. The garden looked normal under the soft light of the lampposts, but his intuition insisted something was wrong. His cell phone vibrated with an urgent message. "Two intruders identified, entered through the back. Team in motion. Do not leave the room." Edward's heart pounded. They had actually come. He checked that his bedroom door was locked and then silently walked to Maria's room. She was sleeping soundly, clutching the teddy bear he had bought for her. For a moment, Edward considered waking her and taking her to the closet, where they could hide until the situation was resolved. But he decided it was better to let her sleep. If all went well, she would never know the danger they had faced. Noises from downstairs indicated movement. Edward heard whispers and cautious footsteps, but he couldn't distinguish if they were the security guards or the intruders. The tension was almost unbearable. His cell phone vibrated again. "Two suspects downstairs. Seem to be looking for someone. Hold position." Edward strategically positioned himself between Maria's bedroom door and the staircase, determined to protect her with his own life if necessary. He could hear whispered voices coming from downstairs, but the words were inaudible. Suddenly, Maria stirred in bed, and her eyes opened. Edward quickly approached and placed a finger on his lips, signaling for her to be silent. She seemed to instinctively understand that something serious was happening. "Daddy," she whispered almost inaudibly. "Are they the bad men?" Edward nodded slightly and motioned for her to get out of bed and come to him. Maria moved silently, demonstrating once again the intelligence and courage that had kept her alive on the streets. Louder voices from downstairs indicated that some kind of confrontation had begun. Edward could distinguish police commands being given. "Police, hands up!" A sound of struggle followed, furniture being knocked over, and shouts of command. Maria huddled against Edward, who embraced her protectively as he tried to assess what was happening. After a few minutes that felt like an eternity, silence returned. Edward's cell phone vibrated. "Area secure. 2 suspects apprehended. You can come down." Edward took a deep breath, feeling relief flood his body. "It's over, sweetie," he whispered to Maria. "We're safe." When they went down to the living room, they found 2 handcuffed men being escorted by police officers outside. Edward recognized one of them from the photographs Robert had shown him. He was definitely one of the wanted criminals. Captain Davis, the operation leader, explained what had happened. "They entered through the back, as we suspected. They had professional equipment and clearly knew the exact location of the girl's room. How did they find out? Prior surveillance. They likely observed the house for days, studying your routine." Maria held Edward's hand tightly, watching the officers with a mix of fear and curiosity. "Daddy, they won't bother us anymore." "No, sweetie, never again." Captain Davis crouched down to Maria's level. "You're a very brave girl." "These were the last criminals from the crew. With them arrested, you can live in peace." Maria nodded seriously. "Thank you for protecting us." After all the police officers left and the house returned to silence, Edward and Maria sat on the living room sofa. She snuggled against him, still processing the night's events. "Daddy Edward, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Were you scared?" Edward considered lying to reassure her, but decided to be honest. "And I was very scared, Maria, but not for myself. I was scared that something would happen to you. I was scared too, but not as much as the first time, because I knew you were with me." Edward hugged her tighter, understanding that that night had been a final test for both of them. They had faced danger together and emerged victorious. "Maria, now we can truly live in peace, without fear, without worry. We're free to build our family." Maria smiled. The first genuine smile since they had come down to meet the officers. "Our family is really strong, isn't it, Daddy?" "The strongest in the world," Edward confirmed, knowing he had found something more valuable than all his fortune, the unconditional love of an extraordinary daughter. 2 weeks after the final confrontation with the criminals, Edward woke up to the sound of laughter coming from the kitchen. It was Monday morning, and Maria was helping prepare breakfast, a routine they had established, and which had become one of the most precious moments of the day for both of them. "Good morning, Daddy," Maria said cheerfully when she saw him enter the kitchen. "I made scrambled eggs just the way you like them, just a little bit overcooked." Edward smiled, observing how she had grown in confidence and joy in recent weeks. The threat of the criminals had been definitively eliminated. And for the first time since they met, they could live without shadows from the past. "Smells delicious," he said, kissing the top of her head. "And how are you feeling today?" "Happy," she replied simply. But there was a depth to that word that Edward perfectly understood. That morning, they had a special appointment at the courthouse. Robert had called the previous week with the news they both eagerly awaited. All the adoption papers had been approved. Maria would officially become Edward's legal daughter. During breakfast, Edward watched Maria eat with the healthy appetite of a child who would never again have to worry about where her next meal was coming from. Her eyes shone with the security of someone who knew she was loved unconditionally. "Daddy Edward," she suddenly said, "can I tell you a secret?" "Of course, sweetie." "When I was on the street, sometimes I pretended you were my real dad. When I went to sleep, I imagined what it would be like to have a real family." Edward felt a lump in his throat. "And what did you imagine it would be like?" "Exactly like it is now, with a warm breakfast, talking about the day. Someone who worries when I take too long to come back from the garden." She paused, playing with her fork. "But you know what I didn't imagine?" "What?" "That I would love so much on the streets. I thought love was just not feeling hungry or cold, but it's much more than that, isn't it?" Edward had to blink several times to hold back tears. "It is much more, yes. It's about worrying about someone else's happiness more than your own. Is that why you did all that, to protect me?" "Exactly, and that's why you took my cell phone, to protect me too." Maria nodded seriously. "So we both know what real love is." An hour later, they were at the city courthouse. In a small but solemn room where the judge responsible for adoption proceedings conducted the ceremonies. Judge Helen Miller was an experienced woman with decades of work in child rights. "Edward Miller and Maria," the judge said, consulting the documents before her, "this is a very special moment. Edward, do you fully understand the responsibilities you are taking on?" "I understand perfectly, Your Honor, and I accept them with more joy than anything I've ever done in my life." "And you, Maria, do you understand that Edward will officially be your father, with all the rights and duties that implies?" Maria looked at Edward and then at the judge, with the seriousness of someone much older than her 7 years. "I understand, and I truly want him to be my official father, because in my heart he already is." The judge smiled, clearly touched by the maturity and sincerity of the answer. "In this case, I officially declare the adoption process concluded. Maria, you are now legally Edward Miller's daughter, with all the rights of a biological daughter." Edward and Maria hugged, both crying tears of joy. It was a moment that represented not only the legal formalization of their family, but the formal recognition of a love that had grown from the most improbable circumstances. Robert, who had accompanied the entire process as a witness, approached with moist eyes. "Congratulations, you two. This is one of the most beautiful stories I've ever witnessed." Leaving the courthouse, Maria held Edward's hand and said, "Daddy, can I use your last name at school now?" "Of course you can. You're Maria Miller now." She repeated the name several times, savoring each syllable. "Maria Miller, I like the sound of that." That afternoon, as Maria was drawing in the living room, Edward reflected on the extraordinary journey they had shared. It had all started with a simple hug requested by a girl on the street, and culminated in the formation of a family based on the purest kind of love, one that arises from the conscious choice to care for another person more than oneself. He picked up his phone and called Carla at the office. "Carla, can you schedule a meeting with our attorneys? I want to establish a foundation for unhoused children." "What kind of foundation, Mr. Miller?" Edward looked at Maria, who had looked up from her drawing and was smiling at him. "One that ensures no child has to face what Maria faced. One that offers not just shelter and food, but family and true love." Maria put down her colored pencils and ran to him. "Will it help other kids like me?" "We will help, Maria, both of us together." She hugged him tightly. And Edward knew they had found not only each other, but also their shared purpose in life. 3 weeks had passed since the adoption was finalized, and Edward was in his office reviewing the documents for the creation of the Maria Miller Foundation, a name that had been the girl's own suggestion, as she had insisted that other children needed to know it was possible to find a real family. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Robert, but this time with good news. "Edward, I have a surprise for you and Maria. I managed to locate John, that unhoused man who gave us information about her whereabouts. He's in a really tough spot, and I asked if you'd like to visit him." Edward looked through the office window, where Maria was playing in the garden with her new toys. After everything they had been through, he felt it was important to close the circle, to revisit the people who had been fundamental in their journey. "Of course, Robert. We'll visit him today. Maria would like to thank him personally." An hour later, Edward and Maria were back in that derelict part of the city where they had found John weeks earlier. But this time, Maria showed no fear or discomfort. She held Edward's hand tightly, secure in her new identity and place in the world. John greeted them with a toothless grin that lit up his aged face. "Maria, you look so different, girl." "You look like a princess." Maria approached him without hesitation and hugged him. "Uncle John, thank you for helping my dad find me." "Your dad?" John repeated, looking at Edward with approval. "So everything really worked out?" "Everything worked out," Edward confirmed. "And we want to make you a proposal." They explained about the foundation they were creating and offered John a job as an advisor, someone who could use his life experience on the streets to help other children in similar situations. "You know this reality better than anyone," Edward said. "Your experience would be invaluable in ensuring our foundation truly makes a difference." John was silent for a few seconds, clearly moved. "You'd do that for me?" "After everything," John, Maria said with the seriousness that had become characteristic of her. "Daddy Edward taught me that when someone helps us, we help them back. You helped me, now it's our turn." From there, they headed downtown, specifically to the street where it all began. Edward wanted to show Maria how that spot had become special to them, no longer a place of need and vulnerability, but the birthplace of their family. When they reached the sidewalk where Maria used to ask for change, she stopped and looked around with a thoughtful expression. "Daddy Edward, Do you remember what I said that day? That I asked for a hug instead of money. I remember perfectly. It was the most important moment of my life. Maria smiled and pointed to the exact spot where they had hugged. It was right here that I tried to save you, Daddy. Edward crouched down to her level, repeating the gesture he had made so many times. And it was right here that you truly saved me, Maria, not just from the criminals, but from loneliness. They hugged again, right there on the busy sidewalk as pedestrians passed by. But this time, they weren't a lonely man and an abandoned girl. They were father and daughter, united by a story of courage and love that had transformed both their lives. You know what I learned, Daddy, Maria said when they separated. And I learned that sometimes, when you think you're doing something wrong, you're actually doing the most right thing in the world. Edward nodded, understanding perfectly. The theft of the cell phone, which initially had seemed like a betrayal, had revealed itself to be the most selfless act he had ever witnessed. Walking back to the car, Maria suddenly stopped and looked back. Daddy, can I come here sometimes? To remember. We can come whenever you want. And can I bring other children from the foundation to show them that there's always hope? Edward smiled, realizing that Maria had instinctively understood the transformative power of her own story. That's a wonderful idea, honey. As they drove home, Maria looked out the car window, observing the city with eyes completely different from those of months ago. She no longer saw just survival and danger. She saw possibilities, hope, and the future. Daddy Edward, she said when they arrived home, do you think our story will have a happy ending? Edward parked the car and turned to look at her. Maria, our story isn't about a happy ending. It's about a happy beginning. Every day is a new start for us. They walked together toward the house, hand in hand, knowing they had found something that neither money nor technology could buy. A family created by the conscious choice to love and protect each other. That night, as he tucked Maria into bed, Edward reflected on how a simple hug had unleashed a chain of events that had changed everything. The street where it all began, once a scene of misunderstandings and dangers, now symbolized the birth of a family united by adversity and strengthened by the understanding that true love sometimes manifests through the most misunderstood and heroic gestures. Technology had made Edward vulnerable, but the genuine love of a brave child had protected him in ways no digital security ever could. And Maria, who once lived on the streets fearing each day, now slept safely knowing she would be loved forever.